Hello everybody and welcome to another top 5 board gaming video. Today's topic is all about games that can accommodate a relatively high number of players but are not based off of social deduction. Essentially, I did a video similar to this quite a while ago where I talked about my favorite high player count games, but the thing is a lot of them are based off of social deduction and social engineering and sort of figuring out who's a good guy, who's a bad guy type of thing. Those games are great for a lot of people, but at the same time, there are quite a few gamers who really do not like the social deduction mechanic. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to focus on games that can still accommodate a good number of players, which is around like 6 or even more, but you have less focus on the social talkative aspect. You still have things like trading and stuff like that to an extent, but you have a lot more personal strategy that you're really associated with. That said, of course, as always, please let me know what your guys' personal picks are in the comments below, because you know that I love to hear from you, and I always love to get new ideas for great board game nights as well. With that said, we're going to jump right on into my number 5. At number 5, I've got Citadels. This is a wonderful little game that is a combination of some great aspects where you've got a high player count, you've got very simple and fast gameplay, you've got wonderful replayability, and a good amount of strategy still associated. This is a tableau building / role picking game, but essentially it's so low on the list because of that role picking aspect. Essentially, you still have some social engineering going on where the idea is that you've got the assassin and the thief trying to kill and steal from people respectively, and you can essentially be targeted if people can guess what role you're picking relatively consistently. So it can be difficult for people to get off the ground if your opponents are really trying to go after you, so it can get a little bit frustrating in that sense, but it's still a good game, it's still a great game, and like I said, very replayable and decently strategic. Citadel's my number 5. At number 4, I've got Concept. In this game, one player has a card that has a list of different things. They pick something they're trying to describe, and the idea is that you utilize iconography on the game table to essentially point out it is this, 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 and this, where you're describing it by color, size, capabilities, all of that kind of stuff, and the other people are trying to guess what it is. It is a little bit to the extent of something like Dixit and things like that, where you can have some very abstract thought and abstract descriptions, but at the same time you have things that are easier to describe and more difficult to describe, so you can sort of scale the game a little bit easier like that. It's also lower on the list because while it can accommodate a lot of players, you end up having to play on teams, and that can be good or bad depending on how well you can interact with one another without speaking and by just having these relatively minor iconography based clues. It's still a fun game, but it might be a little bit too abstract and a little bit too sort of interpretive for some people. Concept, my number 4. At number 3, I've got Bonanza, the game that is all about planting, harvesting, and gaining points from beans. The idea is that everybody has a hand of cards, and you have to plant some number of beans in front of you on your turn. The player interaction aspect comes from you can trade with other players, with the idea being that any card you trade must be planted by the other player immediately, and vice versa. With the idea being that you're trying to get rid of cards that are coming up because you have to plant them in the order that you draw them. It's an interesting game, and you do still have, of course, the social aspect, but it's strictly a negotiation aspect. You don't have the idea of trying to figure out if somebody is lying to you. It's simply, do you have this thing that I'm looking for? Yes or no? And they can either trade with you or not trade with you. You can negotiate, figure out what it is that they want, and so it works wonderfully well. And you can play with up to 7 people in this particular case. It is in the middle of the list because it's not super strategic, but you do still have some strategy just in terms of planning ahead and seeing what other people are getting into and all that kind of stuff, because maybe you want to stay away from some of the things that other people are doing. Bonanza overall, my number 3. At number 2, I've got Camel Up, and while this is a game that is about a camel race, you are not racing any camels. Instead, you and your opponents are playing as bettors who are trying to determine who is going to win the entire race, as well as individual legs as the race goes on. It's a really intriguing game that has some fascinating mechanics, particularly in this one. This is the 2nd edition of the game, where it adds one camel that's moving backwards backwards, and another camel that is not technically part of the race, but is still moving forward. And so the idea is that camels can be carried farther forward or farther backwards during the race with relatively little knowledge of how it's going to happen. It's really, really fun. It's very intriguing in how it's presented, and it's very random in terms of which ones are going to move or not. The great thing about this game is that the social aspect is almost entirely removed. The only time you see sociability is when you have 6 or more players, because then you have betting partnerships that you can enter into, where the idea is that 2 players can share a particular betting card. That's the only time that you really see any social aspect, other than trying to figure out, oh, what are you going to do now? What are you going to do? And essentially just the regular strategy aspect of, shoot, I was going to do that, now I have to think of something else. Great game, tons of fun. Camel Up, my number 2. At number 1, I've got Captain Sonar. Now, this is kind of an unusual pick for this video because it is a little bit niche. This is a real-time game that involves 2 teams. Each team represents a crew on a submarine, with the idea being that you're trying to track down the other team and blow up their boat. So essentially, each team has a captain, you'll have a navigator, a weapons operator, and then a radio operator. And so each person has their own particular job that they're trying to do, and they're trying to relay information to their captain. But again, all of this is happening in real time. So you definitely have the talking back and forth across the table, all this kind of thing. So it can get very hectic and extremely chaotic. But at the same time, it is definitely not social deduction. Essentially what it is, it's much more a very much logical and mechanical deduction, because you're trying to figure out where is your opponent, how can we track them down, how can we get to them, and on top of that, how can we get our own reserves up, how can we get our weapons activated, all of that kind of stuff. It's an absolutely heart-pounding experience that is truly amazing, and honestly, in my experience, unrivaled and unmatched in the pure intensity that you get from it. Captain Sonar, my number 1. Well, everybody, that's going to be it for me. I hope that you enjoyed this video on my top 5 favorite board games that can really accommodate a lot of players, but are not focused on social deduction. I fully understand how it is that a lot of people don't like social deduction. At first, I really didn't either, but it's definitely something that I've personally warmed up to. But I wanted to focus on the other side of the coin for those of you who want to host these larger parties, but don't enjoy games like The Resistance or Werewolf or things like that, where it's all about who's the good guy, who's the bad guy type of thing. So I hope that you really enjoyed this list. Of course, as always, please let me know what your own personal picks are in the comments below, because you guys know I love to hear from you. I love to know what you think about the games I picked, what your personal picks are, anything and everything that you've got, put it in those comments. And of course, if you haven't done so already, please take a look at all of my various social media pages, as well as my Patreon page, where you can interact with myself and my channel in a whole bunch of really fun and unique ways. But that said, thank you so very much again for watching. I hope that you enjoyed the video, and I will see you next time.